The 2008 crisis was noisy, impossible to ignore. Lehman Brothers collapsed over a weekend, and everyone knew. Markets plummeted dramatically, headlines screamed, people lined up at banks. It was obvious, immediate, impossible to deny. And precisely because it was so dramatic, because it made so much noise, it provoked a response. Governments acted, policies were implemented. The world woke up to the crisis because there was no way to ignore it. But what is happening now with artificial intelligence is completely different. It's not dramatic. It doesn't make noise. There's no specific day when everything collapses. It's a silent, gradual, insidious collapse, happening now, at this very moment, as you read these words. But because it's silent, because there's no spectacular Lehman Brothers collapse, most people don't notice. They continue their lives thinking everything is fine, that the problems they see are isolated, that there's no real crisis. And that's precisely the nature of this that makes it far more dangerous than 2008. Because when collapse is silent, when it happens in slow motion, when the signs are scattered and subtle, there's no moment of collective awakening. There's no urgent response, just constant deterioration that normalizes until it's too late to reverse. Let me show you exactly how this silent collapse is unfolding now, why you're not seeing it, and why when you finally do see it, you will have already lost everything that matters. Let's start with what silent collapse versus noisy collapse means. In 2008, you knew you were in crisis. Your 401k lost half its value overnight. Your neighbor lost their house. Your brother-in-law lost his construction job. News was all about financial crisis. It was inescapable. And because it was so obvious, it created a sense of urgency. People demanded action. Politicians were forced to respond. The system mobilized because the threat was clear and present. But silent collapse doesn't work that way. There's no day where everything falls apart. There's no dramatic moment of recognition. Instead, it's a series of small changes, each seemingly insignificant, each easily rationalized, but collectively adding up to the fundamental transformation that destroys societal structure. Think about how it works. A company announces it's implementing a new AI system to improve efficiency. It doesn't announce it will lay off workers. It only says it's modernizing. A few months later, it mentions restructuring. Some positions are eliminated, but presented as part of the natural evolution of the business. Affected people are treated as individual cases of bad luck, not as part of a pattern. Each company does this separately at different times, without coordination. So there's never a moment where millions lose their jobs simultaneously. It's a constant trickle. 100 here, 1,000 there, 10,000 in the next quarter. And because it happens in a distributed way, it never reaches the threshold of public attention that would force recognition of a crisis. And what about people who lose their jobs? They don't make a fuss. There are no mass protests. There are no occupations. Because each person thinks the problem is individual, they think they specifically weren't good enough, that they just need to find another job, that it's a personal failing. They don't see that they are part of a massive wave of structural displacement, and society reinforces this interpretation. The dominant narrative is about individual responsibility, about reinventing oneself, about learning new skills. So people have internalized guilt and shame instead of anger and organization. It's brilliant from the point of view of preventing resistance, and terrible from the point of view of responding to the real crisis. And the numbers are carefully obscured. When a company lays off workers through AI, it doesn't label it as automation. It labels it as optimization, restructuring, strategic realignment. Unemployment statistics don't adequately capture this because many of the displaced give up looking and fall out of the counted workforce, or they accept underemployment in temporary or low-paying jobs that don't show up as a problem in aggregate statistics. The official unemployment rate may seem okay, while the reality on the ground is deteriorating dramatically, and the media isn't telling the story in a way that makes it visible. In 2008, the financial crisis was an obvious story that everyone covered. But with AI, there's no single big story. There are thousands of small stories. Individual worker lost job here, small business closed there, community is declining elsewhere. Each story is covered in isolation, if it's covered at all. Connections aren't made, patterns aren't revealed, and tech companies spend fortunes on public relations ensuring the dominant narrative about AI is positive. Innovation, progress, bright future. Any negative coverage is balanced with stories about new jobs being created, even though those are a fraction of the jobs eliminated. So the public sees scattered signs but doesn't connect the dots. His cousin lost his job but eventually got another, albeit one that paid less. The local store closed but was replaced by a chain. Wages aren't growing but inflation isn't high, so it seems okay. Each individual sign is explainable, not alarming, but aggregated, they paint a picture of systematic deterioration, job quality falling, economic security evaporating, opportunities for the next generation dwindling. But because change is gradual, because each step is small, there's no moment of shock that forces recognition. And here's the truly insidious part. While the collapse is silent for most, the elite are perfectly aware of what's happening. They see aggregated data. They do strategic planning based on massive automation. They know exactly how many jobs they are eliminating and will eliminate. But they have no incentive to make this public. In fact, they have every incentive to remain silent because public acknowledgement would create political pressure to act in ways that would limit their profits. So there is active suppression of the crisis narrative. Not blatant censorship, but subtle shaping of how the story is told, which aspects are emphasized, which experts are consulted, which studies are funded. Compare this to 2008. Back then, the financial elite also didn't want to admit problems, but the crisis was so obvious they couldn't hide it. Numbers were published daily. Market indices are public and transparent. Bankruptcies are public legal events. There was no way to keep it secret. But with AI-driven job displacement, there are no daily numbers being published. There are no visibly falling indices. There are no dramatic legal events. It's structural change happening in thousands of companies simultaneously, but each reporting only its own actions in its own timeline. So the aggregate never becomes visible in a way that forces attention. And let's be specific about signs that are already here but being ignored. First, labor force participation. In the United States, the percentage of the working-age population that is actually working or looking for work has been declining for years. This isn't just baby boomers retiring, it's people of all ages giving up looking because there aren't jobs available that they can do or that pay enough. This is a statistic that rarely makes headlines, but is a deeply worrying sign of structural deterioration. Second, job quality. Increasingly, jobs are temporary, contractual, gig economy, without benefits, without security. This is presented as flexibility and entrepreneurship, but the reality is precariousness and vulnerability. And the pattern is worsening as companies discover they can use automation to coordinate residual human labor in ways that eliminate the need for traditional full-time jobs. Third, real wages. For most workers, inflation-adjusted wages have stagnated for decades. But worse, for workers entering the workforce now, starting wages are lower than the previous generation. This means negative social mobility, something not seen on this scale since before World War II. And this trend is accelerating as automation pushes wages down by creating an oversupply of labor in any category that still employs humans. Fourth, increased despair. Suicide rates are rising. Drug overdose deaths have exploded. Alcoholism has increased. Domestic violence has intensified. These are signs of a society under profound stress, but each is treated as a separate problem with isolated causes. Campaigns against opioids, mental health programs. No one connects that these are symptoms of massive economic displacement and loss of hope. Fifth, family instability. Marriage rates have fallen, birth rates have plummeted. Young adults are living with their parents until increasingly older ages. These are rational responses to economic insecurity, but they are signs of a society where fundamentals are being eroded, and trends are accelerating, not reversing. Sixth, political polarization. Growing extremism is no accident. It is a predictable response to economic deterioration that is not being adequately addressed by mainstream politics. Desperate people seek radical explanations and solutions. And because collapse is silent, because there is no clear narrative of why things are getting worse, alternative explanations thrive. Scapegoats are identified. Conspiracy theories proliferate. All of this is symptomatic of a society that knows something is deeply wrong, but cannot articulate what or why. All these signs are visible now, but each is treated as a separate phenomenon. No one is connecting the dots that they all stem from the same root cause. Massive economic displacement caused by automation combined with the concentration of wealth and power. And because connections aren't being made, there's no coherent response. Only fragmented attempts to address individual symptoms while the underlying cause continues to worsen. And here's why this is more serious than 2008. In 2008, once the crisis was recognized, action was possible. Difficult, controversial, imperfect, but possible. Because the nature of the problem was understood. Bank liquidity crisis, collapse of confidence, asset bubble, known solutions existed, inject liquidity, guarantee deposits, recapitalize banks, stimulate demand. It took time, but it worked because the problem was financial, not structural. The basic system of how the economy works remained intact. But with the silent collapse of AI, when it is finally recognized, it may be too late for the kinds of solutions that worked in 2008. Because what is being destroyed is not just financial wealth, but human productive capacity. When millions have spent years out of the workforce, when their skills have atrophied, when the next generation has grown up without developing skills because there was no point, you can't simply stimulate demand and expect jobs to return. The jobs no longer exist. The skills have been lost, and rebuilding human capital takes decades, not years. Furthermore, when the crisis is finally acknowledged, when it becomes impossible to ignore, the political and fiscal systems that would need to respond will be in far worse shape than in 2008. Governments will have accumulated more debt. Political systems will be more polarized and dysfunctional. Trust in institutions will have deteriorated even further. Therefore, the capacity to mount a coordinated and effective response will be much lower precisely when the need is much greater. And there's a psychological dimension that makes silent collapse worse. In 2008, there was a shared sense that something external, a financial crisis, affected everyone. It wasn't individual fault, it was systemic failure. This allowed for solidarity, collective organization, and a demand for action. But with silent collapse, where each person experiences deterioration in isolation, where each loss seems to be the result of personal failure, where there is no recognition of a collective pattern, there is no solidarity. Only isolation, shame, and individual despair. And this makes resistance or organization for change much more difficult. Think about how you feel when you lose your job during an obvious crisis versus when you lose it during what is supposedly a good time. In a crisis, you know it's not your fault. The market collapsed. The company went bankrupt. Millions are in the same boat. But when you lose your job, while the dominant narrative is that the economy is doing well, you internalize it as a personal failure. And this internalization is paralyzing. It prevents you from seeing that it's part of a pattern, that there are structural causes, that there is a need for collective action. The elite are well aware of this dynamic and exploit it. By maintaining gradual and dispersed change, keeping the narrative focused on individual responsibility, they prevent the kind of collective awakening that could threaten their interests. It's a strategy not of overt oppression, but of fragmentation and isolation. Much more effective in the long run because it doesn't generate the kind of dramatic resistance that obvious oppression provokes. There's also the question of how you define collapse. In 2008, collapse was obvious because it was rapid and dramatic. Asset values fell 50% in months, but if values fall 50% over a decade, adjusting gradually, people adapt psychologically. They normalize each level of deterioration. So in the end, you're much worse off. But there was never a moment of shock. And without a moment of shock, without recognition that there has been a collapse, there is no crisis response. Just gradual acceptance of a new normal that is much worse than the previous one. And that's exactly the pattern we're seeing. Each year is a little worse than the last in subtle ways. Jobs are a little less secure. Wages are a little more stagnant. The cost of living is a little higher. The quality of public services is a little worse. But each step is small enough that people adapt. They adjust their expectations downwards. And 10 years from now, when they look back, they can hardly believe they accepted so much while it happened gradually. Let's be specific about the trajectory. Right now, official unemployment is low, but job quality is declining. In 2 years, unemployment rates will start to rise slightly, but this is attributed to specific reasons, not a structural trend. In 5 years, unemployment will be visibly high, but there's a fragmentation of experiences, so there's no unified narrative. Some sectors will be completely automated, while others still employ humans. In 10 years, it will be obvious to everyone that there is a crisis. But the systems needed to respond are in such poor shape that effective action is impossible. And at that point, what could have been prevented or mitigated years ago can now only be endured. Compare this to the trajectory of 2008. Signs of trouble began to appear in 2006 with a slowdown in the real estate market. In 2007, some hedge funds collapsed, but this was seen as an isolated event. In September 2008, Lehman Brothers fell, and within weeks, the entire world recognized the crisis. Within months, massive responses were mobilized. The construction period was years, but the recognition and response period was months. With AI, the construction period is similar, but the recognition period can take years or decades, and the response, it may never come adequately. And there's an aspect to silent collapse that allows the elite to rationalize and justify in ways that noisy collapse doesn't. In 2008, it was obvious that banks failed, that there was greed and incompetence. There was public anger, albeit misdirected. But with silent collapse, it can be presented as natural evolution, technological progress, creative destruction. People just need to adapt. No obvious villains, no specific events to blame, just economic trends that seem inevitable. And this disarmed narrative prevents the kind of public demand for accountability and change that obvious crisis generates. Worse still, because it's silent, because there's no recognized crisis, no political window for changes that would be impossible in normal times. In 2008, it was possible to carry out massive bailouts, pass new financial regulations, take dramatic actions because the crisis justified extraordinary measures. But with a silent collapse, because there's never a recognized moment of crisis, never a window for dramatic action, only normal politics in normal times, which is captured by interests that benefit from the status quo. And silence is no accident. It's the result of choices about how to organize society, how to measure success, how to tell stories about what's happening. We could measure and publish data on automation, job displacement, and the deterioration of work quality. We could have narratives that connect individual experiences to structural trends. We could have media outlets that investigate and expose patterns, but we don't because powerful interests prefer silence. And in the absence of strong counter-narratives, silence prevails. If you're reading this and realizing for the first time that the collapse is happening now, not later, you're beginning to awaken from what most are still asleep to. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Signs are everywhere. Someone you know who can't find work in their field, a young adult living with their parents because they can't afford rent, a colleague accepting work far below their qualifications, a local business closing because it can't compete with automation. Each example you've probably noticed before, but now you can see it as part of a pattern. And here is the choice you face. You can revert to comfortable denial, telling yourself you're exaggerating, that things will work themselves out, that it's not really that bad. Most people will do this because the alternative is to confront the terrifying truth that the foundations of society are crumbling while almost no one is paying attention. Or you can accept reality and decide to act. Talk about it. Connect the dots for others. Organize. Demand policy changes. Prepare yourself personally. Build communities of resilience. Silent collapse is more serious than 2008, not because the eventual impact will be worse, although it probably will be. It's more serious because its silent nature prevents recognition and response until it's too late. In 2008, at least we had a chance to respond once we saw the problem. With AI, when we finally see the problem clearly, we will have already passed the point where known solutions work. We will be dealing with irreversible transformation of the social and economic structure without a playbook, without consensus, with weakened institutions, amidst massive tensions. The grim truth is that you are living through collapse right now. You're not expecting it, you're not preparing for it, you're in it. And because it's silent, because there are no screaming headlines, because each day seems not much different from the last, you don't recognize what it is. But not recognizing it doesn't change reality. It only ensures that when you finally do recognize it, you will be completely unprepared for what you've lost and for what's coming.